Welcome to this new episode of Intuitive Reactions, the MENA Gulf Regions. This is number 46. I've entitled this new episode From Condolences and Investigations to Flags and Trophies. And the image I've chosen is, for me, a very evocative and disturbing image that is in Jerusalem in front of Damascus Gate on the eastern sector of that city. Let me today, in this short episode, start off with a word of condolences. Some of you might have already heard that Her Majesty Queen Rania of Jordan suffered a loss last Friday. Her dad he passed away on Friday and was buried the following day, Saturday, and Jordan declared 7 days of mourning. Who was Queen Rania's dad? The late Dr Faisal El-Yassin hailed, like the family, from Tulkarem. Tulkarem is in the Palestinian West Bank. He pursued his medical studies in Egypt and then in Ireland, and he settled down for a long period of time in Kuwait before returning to Jordan and retiring there. He spent 88 years on the face of this earth, but it was quite clear from some of the pictures that I saw, some of the video clips, that his daughter, Queen Rania, and a lot of other people were deeply affected by the loss of this man. So may he rest in peace, and may the Almighty and friends and relatives provide solace to Her Majesty Queen Rania as well as to the whole El-Yassin family. Now, from condolences, I move to the second part of my title, which is investigations. And of course, that has to do with the murder of the Al Jazeera journalist Shereen Abu Aqleh and the possible referral of the brief of the case to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Now, the question I have here is very simple. Will this referral work? If this is filed at The Hague, at the ACC, what happens then? Now, interestingly enough, the United States administration and the State Department have said time and again, via the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and others, that an international investigation must be had in the killing of Shereen Abu Aqleh. But they have also said that they do not think that the ICC is the correct or appropriate instrument for this investigation. Why, you might ask? Well, one of many reasons I would suggest is that the USA and Israel, for that matter, are not state parties to this tribunal. They do not recognize the legal jurisdiction of the ICC and have not signed the Rome Statute. However, interestingly enough, and this is where politics blends in rather jarringly with the law, during this Russia-Ukraine war, and we are in the 4th month of this ugly and disturbing war, the US administration has at times hinted at, mentioned that Russia could be referred to the ICC. Now, my question is, how would this work in one case, but not in the other? And of course, the question here is, will the ICC prosecutor, once he receives the file from the Palestinian Authority and from the Al Jazeera, as well as the Federation of Journalists, when they've completed their file and sent it to The Hague, will he open an investigation? I'm confident enough that the predecessor prosecutor, the Gambian judge Fatou Bensouda, will have done so. But what about the incumbent Karim Khan QC? Will he do that? And if he doesn't do that, what will be the reasoning, the arguments for not opening an investigation? I fear that law and politics here are going to clash and are going to create a tug of war that is going to be very, very disturbing and very ugly in the face of an equally ugly murder. Now, there are other options as well. One option would be for the United Nations to open a special tribunal that would investigate this case. And I suppose there are other inquiries that could be had. What is important for me is the existence of an inquiry, an international, unbiased, impartial, independent investigation that would look at all the evidence and decide what has happened, and not only what has happened, but what are the consequences of that killing, that murder. And to say that this has to be done only by the Palestinians or the Israelis, it doesn't work, because with the Palestinians, there will always be claims of political nepotism, and with the Israelis, there will be always claims that they muffled the investigation, they hid the facts. It needs an independent investigation, inquiry that is credible and impartial and would provide the world with what you and I know is the most likelihood scenario. Now, Shereen Abu Aqleh's case or not at the ICC helps me segue on quite easily to the third point I have, and that is the issue of the flags, the flag march. Now, Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Day, the flag march day. Now, Israel says that Jerusalem claims that it is the eternal capital of Israel. According to now Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, it is Israel's to keep, and it is its eternal capital, eternal being quite a big word in my opinion. Some other countries, a few other countries, do not say it is Israel's territory or its eternal capital, but they basically use euphemisms and call it disputed territories. But occupied territory is what labels those lands for the majority of countries, including, incidentally, the EU. And this occupation, by the way, is not only a question of euphemisms and linguistics, it is also that it is an occupation that is against international law, assuming international law works these days in our populist world. But this flag march, this Jerusalem Day, the flag wars, it epitomizes a new old reality in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We now have flag wars. We witnessed that in front of St. Joseph's French Hospital in Jerusalem during the funeral of the murdered journalist Shereen Abu Aqleh. What we saw, the ugly scenes, the way that coffin carrying her body was just about to fall on the ground. Incredible. All this, why? Because the Palestinians were chanting Palestinian nationalist slogans, and some of them were carrying Palestinian flags. The same thing happened, incidentally, yesterday across the Palestinian West Bank, when some Palestinians brazenly or bravely hoisted Palestinian flags. This is, in my opinion, amongst other things, a caustic reminder, one, of how the so-called eternal capital of Israel is so sorely divided. It only takes one of you to take a plane, fly into Israel, or go to Jordan, cross the bridge, and go into Palestine and Israel. Visit Jerusalem, visit the western sector of Jerusalem, and visit the eastern sector or side of Jerusalem. You decide whether you think it is an eternal capital or not. So this is a caustic reminder. It puts paid to the idea that the whole of Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel. And the second thing, it also reminds me, at least, perhaps some of you too, how the apartheid system works in those occupied Palestinian territories. I am stunned, pained, when I see the Israeli army confronting Palestinian demonstrators who basically only have slings and stones and burnt tires. And those Palestinians are pretty much beaten up, clobbered, attacked by the Israeli forces. Blimey. Is this demonstration control mechanisms, which are getting worse and worse? So much so that if you've noticed, in the past, there was a certain reticence, taboo to touch Palestinian women, and the women were basically at the front lines because they were protecting their Palestinian men. But now, no, the women aren't spared this behavior, this violent behavior either. And interestingly enough, when we all see this because of social media, because of the television, because of instant news that travels from one continent to another, the US, interestingly enough for me, has removed the terrorist organization Kach from its terror list, while it has kept what it calls the terrorist organization, the PLO, on that list. Now, I purposely put the word terrorist on both sides of the equation, a little bit to provoke some of you, because some of you will say, hey, Kach is not a terrorist organization. Others would say, what? The PLO? Still a terrorist organization? Come on, figure that one out yourselves, and then put it in that file, dusty file called universal justice. And amidst all these tensions that are happening, not only the murder of Shereen Abu Aqleh, not only all the injustices that are happening across the occupied territories, but also the flag march, also the Sheikh Jarrah evictions, all these things that are happening, there is a shrieking silence from the leadership of the Ram Arab Party, which is in the Israeli coalition, from the so-called left of center parties in the coalition too, and from, by the way, the normalizing countries as well that are carrying on with their own bilateral relations with Israel, as if suddenly the word Palestinian, Palestine has disappeared from the political lexicon of the MENA region. This I don't see, I don't hear, I don't speak approach has become quite interestingly supreme in some quarters. Finally, to sort of shift a little bit and not to give the impression that the only problems of the world are centered in the MENA region, that it's always Palestine, Libya, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Egypt, whatever. Let me shift a little bit as a concluding thought from that area, having already spoken about the flags, having spoken about the investigations, having spoken about my condolences, and let me go to the trophies. Now, some of you might have heard that Kalush Orchestra, the Ukrainian band that won the Eurovision Song Festival or contest, were performing at a charity gig in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. And when they did that, they said that they'd auctioned on Facebook their trophy, the crystal microphone that they won when they won the contest, and sold it for some 840,000 euros, roughly 720,000 pounds, in order to help buy 3 Ukrainian-made PD-2 drones to assist in the war against Russia in that ravaged southeast of the country. Now, I've said that that war was wrong. It was against international law. It shouldn't have happened. Putin made, in my opinion, a mistake. This is the broad statement. Within that broad statement, of course, one can open many, many sub-statements. But let me overlook that. This is neither the time nor the place in such a short YouTube episode. But let me say that people from Henry Kissinger, that famous, some would say infamous, Secretary of State, who is now the world political counselor in some instances and in some places, all the way to many other European EU member states, as well as to many other people in the Arab world, in Latin America, in Africa. Everybody is saying this war must end. And as a conflict resolution person myself, as somebody who's dabbled in conflict resolution, as a practitioner, as a counselor, as an academic, as somebody who's done track 2 negotiations, I would say, yes, of course. Who would disagree with the idea that the war should come to an end? But how will this war come to an end? It's not going to suddenly freeze. There has to be give and take. There has to be compromise. There has to be trade-offs, including territorial trade-offs. A drone here, a drone there will not end the war. So in my opinion, it is important that people start thinking seriously about this and start saying, you know what? We need to sit down. We need to find a way to end the war by coming to some sort of a consensus which is neither in one party's interest nor in the other party's interest. Otherwise, if the war continues, and if some countries, some parts of the media hype it up, if people support one side or the other, if positions get more and more sclerotic, then this is not going to augur well. So another part of the world that needs our thoughts, our prayers if you pray, your action if you act, and let's hope that common sense, horse sense as some call it, would prevail. Take care.